Hello and welcome back to another video. In this one I'll be covering the latest developments throughout the front line, starting out in the Robotyne area, where we here see the Ukrainian forces have managed to regroup their forces after a lot of fighting in the area. And as they regrouped, they started launching attacks towards Robotyne itself. If we take a closer look at the village, the Ukrainian forces have managed to get a foothold within it, which then allows them to now fight within the village rather than on the outskirts of it, which indicates that they have full control over all of the fortifications to the north of the village, considering they entered from the north. So fighting is now happening within the village, as half of it is contested and the Russians only have full control over the southern part now. So we see a lot of fighting within the village of Robotyne, and this indicates, similarly to Robotyne, that the village will most likely fall within a couple of days. After the Ukrainians entered Robotyne, they managed to capture the full village after just a couple more days. So with this, we see that the Ukrainians will most likely capture Robotyne soon. And as I've said multiple times, the Ukrainians, as soon as they capture Robotyne, will launch their main push. And this is because the fact that the first line of Russian defenses is right after it. We see here that if the Ukrainians manage to capture Robotyne, then they will have this as a position here to the north of the first offensive line. To the south, there's the village of Novoprokopivka, and to the east, there's the village of Verbove. So the first offensive line goes to the south of the village of Novoprokopivka. However, straight to Verbove, there is the first offensive line. So the Ukrainian forces can, from this position holding Robotyne, push to the eastern parts through the fields towards the village of Verbove and towards the first offensive line. If they manage to break through, then the position of Novoprokopivka is essentially useless, and the Ukrainians will have the village of Robotyne under their control, which would allow them to avert most of the direct fire as they launch their offensive. So most likely, as soon as the Ukrainian forces capture Robotyne, they'll be able to launch their main push towards Verbove and the eastern parts. There is also the possibility that they'll wait until they've captured Novoprokopivka, after which they will attempt to break through from two directions, towards Verbove and towards the two villages here to the south of Robotyne and Novoprokopivka. But essentially what we're seeing is that they are fighting heavily over Robotyne. They have been fighting over the village since the very first days of the offensive. The 4th of June was a rush towards Robotyne, and now the 18th of August, 2 months and 14 days later, they are still fighting at Robotyne. So this is a very significant moment for the Ukrainian forces. This will be the first village that they take south of Novodanilivka. Then we move on to the Staromayorsk area, where here the Ukrainian forces continue their attacks south of Robotyne, as well as to the direction of Pryotne. So as I've mentioned in a previous video, the fighting here will significantly increase in the direction of Staromenivka. There's the possibility of them losing focus on the western side, but that is not guaranteed. They will most likely try to attack the Russian forces as the Russians are withdrawing, and the Russians will most likely withdraw from these northwestern parts of the first offensive line if the Ukrainians start attacking Staromenivka. So they are trying to prevent a Russian withdrawal from this area and try to cut off the supply lines of the Russian forces by capturing Staromenivka and then moving westwards from that position to try and cut off the Russian forces before they go beyond the first defensive line, which will give them much more fortifications and better supplies than here in the north of the fortifications in the deep defense state. Then we move on to the northern parts by the Kharkiv region, where starting out, the Russian forces started attacks in the direction of Selmahivka. They are attacking from two directions, from the north and from the south. So these are most likely from the village of Polomyichiha, as well as from the village of Novoselivsk, which they recently captured. So with this, they are able to attack Selmahivka from two directions. And as we see, this is a tall village, but not very wide. So essentially, them attacking from the two sides, and then with cover fire from the eastern parts, they are able to essentially have the whole village under fire as they are attacking. So the Russian forces are trying to storm the village from multiple directions. So this village is one that the Ukrainians have been able to hold on to heavily, and this is most likely because of the Serebets River going through it. So with the Serebets River going through the village, the Russians are having a hard time storming it, as they would have to cross a river while the fighting is heaviest within the village. So we're seeing that they are attacking from the northern and southern parts. This is most likely to draw out the Ukrainian forces and spread them out around the village, and then hit them with artillery fire to the point at which they can start crossing. And once they've started crossing, they're able to take the village. So this is heavy fighting ongoing in this direction. However, there's no clear outcome yet. As for the very northern parts, the fighting continues by the village of Sinkivka. As we see here, the Russian forces continue their attacks both in the direction of Sinkivka, but most importantly to the eastern parts of it, where they've managed to physically capture the intersection between Sinkivka and Petropavlivka, the road that goes between the two villages. And with this, the Russians have entered the village from the eastern part and from the northern part, as heavy fighting continues for the village, which leaves it in a gray zone. At the same time, the Russian forces managed to advance slightly here to the east of the area, to the south of Vilshana, and they've managed to capture the fields here in the east of Sinkivka as well. So the Russian forces are here continuing their attempts at capturing Sinkivka and advancing towards Petropavlivka, and they are advancing ever so steady. We then also move on to the Sumy region here to the north of the country. We see that the Russian forces have allegedly increased the amount of deep reconnaissance operations in this area, which could indicate some movement there. And with the last video, we saw that the Russian officials announced that they were preparing an offensive. So which scale and how it would happen and so on, that is still under questioning. But the effect that the offensive will happen is true. And according to a interview Lukashenko did yesterday, he claims in that there is 250,000 trained volunteers of the Russian army that has not been deployed in the war yet. This aligns with the narrative of the Russian Ministry of Defense. They have been saying that since the start of January 1st until the 4th of August, there was 236,000 volunteers to the Russian army. And this is besides the mobilized infantry. So with 236,000, by now that would be 250,000. That is exactly what he's talking about. Whether or not all of them are fully trained, that's into question though, as by June it was 150,000. So since June there's a new 100,000. By 2 months they wouldn't have been finished training yet, and as it's continuous, so most likely there's somewhere around 100,000 that isn't finished training yet, but 150,000 that has. And if Wagner is still in the picture, that's easily 250,000. So with that, the Russians are definitely capable of launching a massive offensive across the whole front, similar to what they did at the start of the war, especially with how the Ukrainians are draining their forces by their own offensive, which so far has had little to no yield. Finally, there is this tank-on-tank battle which was operated and took place and reported from the southern front around the Robotyne/Staromayorsk area, so somewhere by the Zaporizhia front. So we see here some Russian and Ukrainian tanks duke it out, and this battle actually takes a very long time as it continues on to the night, and it's a 6.5 minute long video. So if I commentated it for so long, that would end the video in 20 minutes. So I'll most likely just make a Patreon video where I'm commentating on the developments of the fight and exactly what happens in it. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.